Our trending topic today is immigration and the border crisis, and we're going to talk about this very important topic. Hopefully, we're going to hit more of the psychological angles on it. I don't think we need to spend a ton of time talking about that it's bad and that we're upset about it and that kind of thing. I think we don't need another bunch of voices saying that kind of thing because I think that's been pretty apparent. I do want to ask you all two broad questions. And the first is really why you think that this thing has become a issue that has bubbled up so intensely in the forefront. Obviously, we're in the era of Trump and all that goes with that. What is happening, do you think, culturally, that where this has become the forefront issue? Any thoughts on that to start with? Emma Kate?
Yes. So I think Latin American countries are not presently safe. And again, I'm speaking based on limited information and what research I've done. So this is a generalization. But I think people are getting desperate. The drug cartel situation is out of control. Corruption everywhere. And what's happened is people have learned, okay, if we all create this mass exodus, this caravan to the border system gets inundated and overwhelmed. And then they've learned, oh, well, if a whole bunch of us come at once, then we're less likely to stay in the system as long, and then we'll eventually get in to the United States. So I think it's a combination of desperation and then also just this ease of communication where, okay, so a family member makes it in and then, they find a job and it gives them hope and they say, okay, now it's time for you to come too. And there's a whole lot of other things I want to say, but that is my succinct beginning.
Well, let me push back on that a little bit. I don't know if what you said is true or not for real. I mean, I don't know if that's really what's happening, but let's say that it is. Wouldn't it make sense if you're in a country that is below the southern border and you're aware that the U.S. is becoming increasingly less hospitable to immigrants, particularly those coming over the southern border, that you would be less inclined to do that? Why risk that with your family, with your children? So what's going on there?
Within my preparation for this particular episode, I listened to a phenomenal podcast with a gentleman named Ed Calderon, who is on the Joe Rogan Experience. And I got a really unique perspective that I had no idea about. And I don't think this particular podcast referenced what I'm talking about right now, but essentially traffickers are openly advertising that they will help people get into the United States. And they're actually pushing it even more right now because of the fact that the borders may close, because you may have a harder time getting in if you wait. So now it seems like, okay, we may not be able to do it if we don't do it at this moment in time. So let's go.
Frank?
Well, actually, while there are more illegal immigrants in this country, the percentage is actually down. And the percentage of people trying to come to the U.S., I was looking, it was in 2016, there was less than 3% of the population that were undocumented. And in 2007, it was 13%. So there are fewer undocumented people in the country. And I'd also say about that whole Central American thing, that was CIA, the United States, created that whole situation. But
I mean, do we know that? I feel like we're getting into the Alex Jones territory here. Like, isn't that the guy's name?
Yeah, I mean, you look back at Nicaragua and our involvement with the Panama Canal, and I mean that all that stuff goes back to the 60s and 70s. It's a destabilized area. It's like what Emma Kate said. There's a ton of corruption. There's dictators.
You're saying the destabilization of the region is due to our meddling in that. Okay.
Yes. But what was the original question, Dave?
It's really like why is this now? Like we've had
Yeah.
people coming across the southern border for forever, and now it's right. What's going on?
I mean, I've said this a million times, but it's the nostalgia for racism, the nostalgia for white power, the nostalgia for men at the top of the food chain, and it's fear-mongering, it's division societally, it's believing in crap Facebook stuff. I mean, if you go up to some of these people and you say, hey, guess what? 60% of the undocumented people in this country are people who came here on a visa and just overstayed their visa, they won't believe you. That's not true. They're coming across the border. They're bringing in terrorists, which has never happened. It's this. You see it in Congress. You see it in Trump's racist tweet. These people are afraid of people of color because you don't see him going after, undocumented people that overstayed their visa from China or Japan. It's just Latinos.
But how is that
They would be
related to them? Like, why are people coming?
Oh, I think, but what you're saying, but I don't. They're not coming in any greater numbers than they ever have.
But
It's the same. It's actually, according to these stats, it's decreased.
And do you feel like we know that? Do you feel like that's there's hard data on that?
Yeah, it's from. I can cite it.
Let's. Well, why don't we do that in the posting of the article? We'll cite that.
Okay.
Jonathan, any thoughts about it?
Well, I think immigration is actually a global issue. I mean, we're seeing that even in Europe and xenophobia. And when I was growing up, at least with the education that I was provided and kind of the news outlets and what I would read in the news, America always seemed to turn to Europe and point for progress. Like they were further along than us in terms of tolerance and integration of different ethnicities. And I'm seeing Europe kind of crumble into xenophobia and racism as well. Mm-hmm. And so if that's happening over there, to me, it was sort of inevitable. There's some type of cycle that we're about to hit that as well. And we're in an era where xenophobia and overt, very out in plain sight racism has become more of a norm than just even 5 years ago. And I think that the border crisis and illegal immigrants in this very twisted psychological way is a legal loophole for racism because they try to make the argument they're breaking the law. They're breaking the law. And so it's sort of more self-justifying that they're doing that. But I also believe that it's just the here and the now. Both sides are paying more attention to it because we really haven't been able to come up with, I think, a sensible and humane policy to address this. I mean, on the one hand, we are the land of freedom and opportunity. That's how America, at least white America, was established. There are people that are looking for greater life for themselves or their children. There is a lot of political and economic destabilization in the southern countries, but it's creating problems that I think we've either turned a blind eye to or we create short-term solutions that the next person in the office has to clean up.
You know, all those are good points. It is fascinating to me to think about what is perception and what is reality, because we really don't know a lot in terms of, like, you have some people that go to the camps and say they're inhumane and they're worse than they've ever been, and other people that say that's not true. And then, it seems like the truth is a little bit of both. It depends on what camp you're in. And, Imikate's point is that there are sociological factors that are driving increases. Frank's point is that there's a perception that there's an increase and maybe not so much. I do wonder about that because I know how we tend to be. It's like the stories about the Dominican Republic and people dying over there. But when you look at the data, it's no more Americans are dying in the Dominican Republic than they were 2 years ago. the same thing. I remember when I lived in Charlotte, there was a high profile event where a woman was stabbed in a parking deck uptown. And then all the stories were, has uptown become more unsafe, and uptown, and all these stories about crime. But when you looked at the stats, actually crime was down. It was lower than it had been, but the perception was it's become more dangerous. So I wonder about that piece of it. Emma Kate, you had a thought.
Well, I feel like psychologically what we're seeing is just very classic in-group, out-group, right? I want to protect my group, my people, my, my assets, and we want to take down the other side, so to speak. And that is just something evolutionarily. I know we've talked about that. So I can't emphasize this enough. As I was preparing for this, I was able to find and uncover a lot of information that I just had never heard about in the media. And again, that episode from the Joe Rogan podcast really opened my eyes because it was a perspective that I'd never heard. And so for a little context, Ed Calderon was essentially a former Mexican federal police officer, and he worked specialized covert operations with the cartel and has, 10 plus years of experience on the, protecting the northern part of the Mexican border there. And he actually ended up quitting that position because of how dangerous it was, and ended up moving to the United States, became a citizen, and, talks about, and it's kind of like the small grass movement where he's literally trying to help people understand the people of Tijuana are completely inundated by these migrant caravans that are coming in. It's very disruptive to their day-to-day lives, their businesses. He commented on how the media is showing a very one-sided view, and how essentially people can just fly to Canada and walk down over the border with nothing, and talked about how, really this wall is kind of pointless and futile, but at the same time, he's also like, go for it. We need everything we can, because I think there is so much more going on with drug cartels than we realize. And a lot of this is something that's created by the drug industry itself and narcotics and all those sorts of things where, like I discovered too, and I had no idea about this, and I'm going on a little bit of a soapbox here about, are you guys familiar with Operation Fast and Furious? Did you guys ever hear about that? Okay, so I had never heard about that. And for our listeners, it was essentially that there was a Phoenix, Arizona, the Bureau for Firearms, Tobacco, Alcohol, they kind of in collaboration with the government sold illegal or allowed the illegal sale of certain weapons to specific Mexican cartel. And we're not talking just like guns. We're talking about weapons that can stop a car and shoot down a helicopter. And so they essentially armed the cartel with weapons that would prevent, Mexican authorities or other people trying to protect the region from doing that. And I had no idea. And there was this whole issue where, the Attorney General, Eric Holder, was cited for contempt over this. President Obama tried to assert executive privilege, but then Congress and a federal judge rejected that. And this is a much more complex and hidden problem than I think anyone realizes. And people that are, some of the cartel family members live in the United States, and their kids are going to come of age. And there's just, I don't know. So I guess my point is there's a lot of stuff that we don't know. And I think there's this whole agenda with the Democrats, liberals versus conservatives, Republicans. And the reality is we have got to address this together. Yes, we can't. I'm sorry, it's happening. Let me say one more thing, please. One more thing. If we don't stop the lack of bipartisanship, we're going to have a much more significant crisis.
For sure. And I think what we're talking about here is making the point that it's much more complex. There's lots of things that we don't know or things that we know that we're not sure of. And I think that's how everyone is. The part I think that we're clear on is the portrayal, at least from the current administration, of immigrants, or the vibe that is currently in place, is that it is dehumanizing. It is there's something happening differently there in terms of the attitude. It's demonizing, dehumanizing. And so I want to make sure that we have time to hit on this point, which is we do know that a lot of these children in particular and adults are in conditions that are pretty awful in these detention centers, that particularly kids who some are 7 and younger are being separated from parents for weeks on end. The law or the guidelines specify 72 hours, but they're being kept there for weeks on end. What do we know about the psychological impact of that kind of thing particularly on kids? Anyone want to jump in on that?
It's going to be a whole generation of trauma. I mean, even younger, you've got kids that are going to have some attachment problems. I'm sure there's unsupervised sexual abuse. I mean, it's almost like sort of the psychological approach of I would assume of the guards or people that are there also have this us versus them mentality. When you look at the way prisons develop in a culture of holding other humans prisoner, but especially little kids, I would almost seem they have some of these guards maybe even just stop seeing them as children.
Yeah, there's going to be widespread neglect. You don't expect the people that are there to have the type of training. I think without clear transparency from government as well as humanitarian organizations, anything can go on in there, and we're being left out to make sure that there are basic standards of decency happening, which really that may be a contradiction, just to have these camps where children are separated and they're having to, kind of soothe themselves, or children having to parent other children. Mm-hmm. And there's going to be a growing mistrust of authority figures or Americans. Like the ramifications are just endless.
Kate, any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I always think about a brain-based perspective where there's research from orphanages that can demonstrate the impact on the frontal lobe development, which is going to cause problems with working memory, executive functioning, planning, judgment. There's even some research, too, about how the hippocampus, which is responsible for processing memory and emotions, can be smaller when, you're in an institution for an extended period of time. And so especially for these infants and kids up to 6 years age, the amount of brain change and growth that's happening is so much that it's a really sensitive time, and it's really scary.
Yeah, and our failure to deal with this well and to take care of these kids well, and I know that some people would argue that it shouldn't be our problem, but it is our problem. Like it is. There are lots of things that you have to deal with as a government and as a people that you don't want to have to deal with, natural disasters, all kinds of things. And so the fact that you've got this flood of these people in these camps, that is something that it's incumbent upon us to deal with in a humane and kind and good way. Two things about that. Number one is I think you can mark this down in the years to come. As more light gets shed on this, there's going to be a lot of stuff that's going to come out that's going to be horrifying. The second thing is it's incredibly short-sighted because, as you guys are talking about, we know that abuse is bad on kids, but neglect is in some ways even worse, chronic neglect. And so you're going to have kids that if they are then part of the U.S. culture, they're going to have myriad problems, emotional, behavioral, academic, that just the impact of that is going to be felt for a generation or more. So, yeah, it's a big deal. I love Emma Kate's point of we really have got to get past this division, us versus them, not being able to hear the other side, and really problem solve this thing. So that is where we're going to leave this. And that's going to do it for this edition of the Shrink Tank podcast. If you like this episode, we hope that you'll help our podcast grow by giving us a good rating on iTunes and also telling your friends to subscribe. And if you didn't like it, you can tell us why by giving us feedback by emailing us at feedback@shrinktank.com. And for more content exploring the intersection of psychology and pop culture, you can visit shrinktank.com. We have great articles and videos, and we also have links to some of the recommendations that we make here. You can follow us on Twitter at shrink_tank and like us on Facebook. And if you're watching us on our YouTube channel, which we hope you are, we'd love for you to subscribe. You can find us wherever you listen to podcasts, so check out the description box below. Our producer and theme music composer is Sean Beck. Our associate producer and social media guru is Mariel Butler. Our marketing intern is Sarah Bradley. For Emma Kate Wright, Jonathan Hederley, and Frank Gaskell in Charlotte, I'm Dave Verhagen in Nashville. Tell all your friends about us and make it a great week.
Okay.